I have sort of an unusual name for this talk, and I'm sure you're kind of interested to see what it has to do with all the things that you just heard about. Well, I'm going to talk about philanthropy has a bright future, even in the era of Justin Bieber. And the way this came about is, how many of you represent nonprofit organizations? Okay. Well, I'm sure that you're probably getting questions from the foundations that fund you, the kind of questions you never used to get a few years ago, like, okay, how many Twitter followers do you have? And how about retweets? And what's the bounce rate? And what's the time on site? And all these kind of analytics that foundations have begun to learn to sort of use, and in some cases abuse. So I was curious about what is really the play that our sector gets in social media, in this case Twitter. So I thought I'd sort of pit Justin Bieber against the heavyweight in our sector, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the largest foundation in the world. So I went to a Twitter analytics tool called Topsy. It's a great tool if you don't know it, called Topsy.com. And I searched for tweets over a 1-month period, tweets that mentioned Justin Bieber versus tweets that mentioned the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And this is what I got, okay? The top chart there is Justin Bieber, okay, 32.2 million. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, 3,468. And I tried this with a bunch of different months. It didn't make any difference. Every single month, Justin Bieber outdid the Gates Foundation by 10,000 to 1. So the Gates Foundation people gave me a call, said, well, you know, that's really not fair because, you know, what if you did Bill Gates? So I tried Bill Gates. And I got, again, 32.2 million to 107, a little bit better, 171,000. So we're in a world where social media matters, but it matters different for different sectors. So when you pit Justin Bieber against the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the undisputed champ is Justin Bieber. Now, I'm sure that the most, you've probably seen this, the most conspicuously displayed item at philanthropy conferences these days is the iPad. Philanthropists have learned to enter the digital age. And even Barbie has an iPad. I don't know if you've seen this. This is the new entrepreneur Barbie doll. Okay, she comes with, I think, an iPad and a phone, and it's actually a pretty cool thing because it's encouraging young girls to get into tech, which is a sector which is really dominated by males. But the difference is, I mean, look at what Justin Bieber's fans are tweeting about, okay? And then look at what the Gates Foundation fans are tweeting about. We can't match a medium that is dominated by One Direction or Justin Bieber. But what we have in our sector is quality. And really, this is a world that we've entered into, which is made up of ones and zeros. It's a digital world. You've heard this in a number of the speeches. And try to imagine what we could do if we could harness that digital information. This is a mapping platform that the Foundation Center is actually just released this week in beta. It's going to go live September 16th. And what you're seeing is all the data we have on grant making around the world in an interactive mapping application. So what can you do with this? Well, we can go to Australia. Now, this doesn't represent all the philanthropy in Australia because we don't have access to that data. And a lot of you don't have access to that data. We have some Australian philanthropy, but we have lots of grant making going on in Australia from US foundations and other foundations around the world. So let's go to Melbourne, for example, where we are today. And you can begin to see that there's a number of grants appearing in Melbourne. And we can go right down to a street corner. This is a mapping application just like you use to find a Starbucks or a convenience store. And you can see an organization based here in Melbourne that is getting a lot of international grants. Okay? It's the International Detention Coalition. It's a coalition of about 250 organizations that defend the rights of asylum seekers around the world. And you can even see one particular grant made by the Oak Foundation, a foundation actually that I worked for in Geneva, Switzerland for a number of years, to fund the International Detention Coalition. Now, imagine if we not only had the information about grants, but we had all sorts of demographic information that we could layer onto this. So what you're looking at is actually an advanced version of the same mapping application. And you're looking at a neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. And you're seeing grants all throughout Brooklyn, New York. And then you can sort of draw a shape, that pink thing on it. And you can draw that shape any way you want to. And what the software will do is average all the demographic indicators for that shape you've drawn 5 years. It'll look back 5 years into the past and project them 5 years into the future. So think about you're playing a grant-making strategy. You're a nonprofit trying to figure out who lives and what the demographics is in the catchment area. And your catchment area doesn't fit a census block. You can draw a free-form shape and get the information. This is just an idea of what we could begin to do if we harnessed what is big data. Now, big data came on the scene in a very important study that McKinsey did in 2011. And what this graph shows you is the potential contribution to the economy if big data could be harnessed for different sectors. So you see all sorts of sectors on there. You see information, you see health, you see administrative services, you see government even, but you don't see philanthropy. And I don't think McKinsey left philanthropy out because of any malice. I think they probably just never stopped to think of it as an industry. But philanthropy is an industry, so let's take a look at it. In the US alone, there are 86,192 independent foundations. These are endowed foundations. They have $793 billion in assets. That's what we project their assets will be in 2014. They give away about $55 billion every year. But it's a very heterogeneous universe. You've got the Bill and Melinda Gates at one end gives away $3 or $4 billion a year and has 1,300 employees. And then you've got a husband and a wife and a checkbook at the other end. And 76% of these 80-some-odd thousand foundations only have 4 staff or less. And this shocked us when we actually did the search on this. Only 7% of them have websites. Now, you could say, well, why does a small foundation need a website? Maybe it doesn't have any staff. But we looked at the large foundations with assets of over 100 million. And we still found that 30% of them didn't have websites. So John talked about information sharing, but we have a long ways to go as a sector before we enter into the world of big data. Now, this is just the US sector. There's an equal number of foundations with similar assets in Europe. You add Australia, Brazil, Russia, China, all the places where philanthropy is booming, and you've got hundreds of thousands of foundations around the world and well over $1 trillion in assets. Now, foundations have tremendous virtues. First of all, they don't have to compete on the market. They're free from that. Also, they don't have to run for political office, okay? So they don't have to go around kissing babies, or they don't have to appear on stage with large teddy bears, okay? Now, also, in foundation, nonprofits will resonate with this, they don't have to raise money. So that means that foundations are free to do lots of things that virtually no other sector in our world is free to do. And one of those is to support people to take risks. The other is to stick with causes and issues for the long term. And, yet another is to fund ideas. But like anything in life, philanthropy, when it comes to big data, has the defects of its virtues. So I want to talk about some of those defects when it comes to big data. And I want to give you 3 things that foundations need to stop doing, and 3 things foundations need to start doing to really enter in and take advantage of the era of big data. The first of these is to stop trying to be unique. There is no law, natural or otherwise, that says that foundations have to be unique. There are reasons that they are. They're usually tied to very strong-minded, successful individuals that have enormous amount of confidence about how they can solve problems around the world. But they don't have to be unique. But because they see themselves as unique and they don't have these kinds of pressures, market pressures, political pressures, fundraising pressures on them, they tend to create their own information islands. Foundations are pretty much free to label their programs and their priorities however they want. So you may find a foundation that is working on job creation in poor urban areas, and they may be calling it the New Urban Economy Program, and somebody may be calling it a youth employment program, and people who are trying to get access to resources in those foundations don't realize they're doing the same thing, and those foundations often don't realize they're doing the same thing. So philanthropy has created for itself the equivalent of a biblical Tower of Babel. And we think of ourselves as a sector, and we are a sector, but I think the appropriate image is more like an archipelago. I mean, think Indonesia. Indonesia is a nation, but it's a nation of 16,000 islands. We're a sector of hundreds of thousands of information islands, each with its own language, its form of evolution, its own practices. The second thing that foundations need to stop doing is to stop developing custom grants management systems. Now, a lot of the early foundations, the big ones like Kellogg, they had no recourse because commercial products didn't exist, so they had to create their own systems. But today, lots of foundations continue to do this. They think their process of grant making is somehow unique and it requires a very special process, so they go out and create a software. And a lot of times these software are kind of like a Rube Goldberg advice. I mean, this is kind of cute, actually, if you see how inventive this guy's got, but how circuitous he's got to turn on his television. And the purpose of these grants management systems historically has been to issue a check, right? The grant request comes in, all this information gets processed, and out at the other end pops a grant. That was really the purpose of these. But today, there's much better software available. These are partners that the Foundation Center works with, so foundations can export their data to us and can import data from the Foundation Center. A new product like Flux, which is came out of Silicon Valley, is a grant-making management software that is beginning to really function like a workplace. It draws in information from Google, Salesforce, from the Foundation Center, from GuideStar, and really allows foundations not just to process grants, but to get all sorts of information about the organizations they're funding and considering funding. Another one is Foundant, for example. Now, Foundant is one we work with quite closely, and we've developed something called an API. And all that means is it allows their computers and anybody using the software to talk to our computers. And one of the things you have to do when you're a philanthropist, I was a program officer for years. When I was writing up a grant, the first thing I had to find out is who else is funding that organization. Okay. Now, the way I got that information, and the way people still get it today, is they tend to call up the grantee organization and ask them, who else is funding you? Well, with this kind of integration, basically, this is a mock grant to Jimmy's Soup Kitchen. You can click on that, and you can find out automatically who else is funding Jimmy's Soup Kitchen. And then maybe you don't recognize one of those foundations, because there's many more foundations out there than we know about. And you can click that, and you can get information about the foundation. The third thing that foundations need to stop doing is treating data and communications as two separate things. Now, philanthropy came very late to the idea of communications. You know, it's kind of a private industry, low profile, modest, doesn't want to call attention to itself. And the first sort of generation of communications people at foundations were speechwriters. They essentially wrote speeches, press releases, things like that. But today, you know, as we saw in the beginning, foundations are beginning to blog, they're tweeting, they're on YouTube. And indeed, in a survey we did, we found that about 45% of foundations, this is in the US, are engaged in some form of social media. So communications is changing. But what we also need to understand about communications is your data needs to support your message. This is a mapping application that the Foundation Center developed for a donor collaborative that works on water access, sanitation, and hygiene around the world. 900 million people in the world don't have access to safe water. A group of very important foundations work on this issue, but they really don't know what each other's doing. They don't know what other foundations are out there that are working in this space that they don't have contact with. And they also know that the really big funders in this space are not foundations, they're international government aid programs. So it's the World Bank, it's the Asia Development Bank, it's DFID, it's USAID, it's the Australian Foreign Aid Program. So what this map is showing you actually is the relationship of foundation funding to international official development aid funding. And the much larger circles are the aid funding, and the smaller circles are the foundation funding. And even at the Foundation Center, when we produce a research report today, we don't produce any more 120-page research reports because people don't read them. So we found that to get people to understand the important messages about philanthropy and how philanthropy is tackling some of the most important problems in the world, you need to show them data, and you need to show them infographics, and you need to make the information come alive. And to do something like this takes lots of data. John talked about data. And data is ones and zeros, okay? Data is not just numbers. It's anything that comes in digitally. So to create something like this, it uses websites, it uses outcomes and impact data, it uses social media, it uses grants data, it uses demographic data, it uses geographic information systems data, and this is what could potentially power philanthropy. So what do we need to start doing? Well, the 990PF, a lot of you know what that is. It's the compliance document that foundations have to fill out in the United States and file with the Internal Revenue Service. We're very fortunate to have that in the United States because it creates the ability to have a minimal amount of information about the entire sector. But other countries have different kinds of compliance documents. So the important thing is to get beyond the compliance document. So why is that? Well, it's good that we have it, but it's not a great document. It's full of mistakes. Some of them are filled out in pencil. The Internal Revenue Service makes them available, but they sit on them for a long time. It takes a long time for the foundations to fill them out. And we get them on DVD-ROMs because they're image files. They're not even something that you can plug into a computer. So working with them is a bit like this. And I have a colleague here, Jeff Falkenstein, who is our Vice President for Data Architecture, and he has 40 staff that primary job is to pull information off these forms, clean it, and turn it into the kind of mapping applications and other kinds of things you saw. But let's look again at how to get beyond these compliance forms. So we looked at philanthropy as an industry. Well, something new is beginning to happen. 800 foundations in the United States, but also in parts of Europe and the developing world, are reporting their data electronically to the Foundation Center. They're bypassing these forms completely, sending it in, and getting back ways that they can use that data to find each other and collaborate. The second thing is to start aligning your data with the outside world. Especially if you're starting up a foundation and you know you're going to work on a certain issue. Before you begin to develop some kind of coding system and descriptive thing to align all of your grants and your activities to your priorities, stop and look at how data is already organized in those issues in the real world. And that will increase the chance that you'll be able to understand what you're doing in relation to what the rest of the world is doing. There are lots of data systems out there. The Foundation Center, GuideStar, and the National Center for Charitable Statistics in the US have similar data structures and taxonomies to describe the work of philanthropy. OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has a taxonomy that describes international aid giving for important issues. The International Aid Transparency Initiative, this is something the Australian government is actually leading in terms of reporting its international aid data in machine-readable open format according to this IATI data standard. There's lots of standards out there that you can grab and you don't need to create them. And there's a geographic standard. I mean, this may sound kind of stupid, but the world does not agree on the description of the world. There are 7 different geographic systems in use in the United Nations. There are 5 different official government definitions for the Deep South in the United States. So the Foundation Center worked with a bunch of foundations and created a geographic standard that can be used by philanthropy to describe the world and aggregate information. And why do we need to do this? Well, this is a highway sign, but the number is very important. A simple question, like how much general support, how much general operating support does philanthropy provide, is virtually impossible to answer. Now, why is that? Because we looked at 160,000 grants, and we found 251 unique ways that foundations described general support. And this is one of my favorite, like in case you didn't get the message, right? For unrestricted funds for operational development. Why didn't you say general support? Okay. And then the last thing is to start thinking about your data as open. We live in a world where we know a lot about each other and a lot about everything, because so much is available on the web and so much data is being scraped from all over the place and indexed by Google search engines, by Bing, and by Yahoo. And when you stop and think about it, foundations do a lot more than just function as an ATM machine. They are enormously privileged institutions, and that's because they take in huge amounts of information. They take in proposals, they have conversations, they get grantee reports, they fund research, they do some of their own research, they publish annual reports, and all that is incredibly important information. And in today's world, it's digitized information, which means that it can be manipulated, it can be researched, it can be aggregated, and it can be turned into knowledge. Now, the traditional audience for that organization has been the internal staff. But, as I said, increasingly, people are consuming your information. So there's a lot of people telling stories about what your foundations are doing while we're sitting here in this room based upon what's available on the web. So you might as well start thinking of your information as open. And a group of foundations have actually done this. They've started something called the reporting commitment, where they're deciding to report all of their grant-making data real time in machine-readable open format and geocoding it according to a common geo standard. These are the foundations that are doing it. It's some of the biggest foundations in the world, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, but also a very small foundation. And that small foundation is the VNA Foundation that has 3 staff. And this is not just something that big foundations can do. Small foundations could do it as well. And this information is being visualized on a map. People can grab it. They can use the data. The foundations can use it. Nonprofits can use it. Consultants can use it. Everybody can use it to tell stories about what philanthropy is doing in the world. Another way to share information is the ideas of foundations. Foundations produce ideas. They fund ideas. They just don't give away money. These are ideas. These are examples of searchable knowledge sites on different websites. Now, these are all connected to a repository called Issue Lab, which has over 15,000 publications in it. And each one of these reports has tags on it so it can be searched. It has an abstract on it so it can be found. And this is all connected in a way so that when, for example, Philanthropy, if we connected Philanthropy Australia to Issue Lab, when they post a publication on their site, it would also go into Issue Lab. They could pull things from Issue Lab. Their own users could see whatever they have on their site. Anything they put on their site, all the users of Issue Lab could see. It would go into the Foundation Center's websites, and then it would go out to all that audience. And most importantly, because these tags and those abstracts I showed you are done according to something called the Open Data Protocol, the Open Archives Protocol, they're machine readable and they're harvested by WorldCat, which is the worldwide network of 10,000 libraries. So think of the ideas of philanthropy going out to 10,000 libraries, going out to multiple communities around the world that care about what you do. Now, I want to give you just a few cautions and then wrap this up. One is that when it comes to data, you can't be a glutton. You can't only consume data. The way this works is you have to give data to get data. You've got to be in the matrix. Okay? That's the way the data world works. And the second thing is that when I go to foundations today, the most common thing I see is foundation leaders either show me a row of file cabinets and say, we're getting rid of all those, we're digitizing everything. Or they show me an empty wall that says that's where our file cabinets used to be. Now we've got everything, on these hard drives, right? And now the hard drives increasingly are migrating into the cloud, but that doesn't mean necessarily that we've done anything with all this information. And I think the biggest mistake foundations make is they don't really take advantage of their information because they think, well, how can we capture all of this stuff? How can we create an information system and collect data on everything we do? Well, you don't have to. So I'm going to turn to one of the most important experts on computer science, Pablo Picasso, who said a great thing. He said, computers are useless. All they can give you answers. The most important thing before you embark on collecting and sharing data for your organization is to know what questions you want to ask. And that will define what kind of data you need to master. Now, just to summarize, stop trying to be unique, stop developing custom grants management systems, stop treating data and communications as separate. Start aligning your data with the world, go beyond your tax compliance forms, and begin to think about your data as open. And 2 cautions. You have to give data to get data, and get your questions right first. Now, I want to close with a great quote. And this quote is, "So far as there is a justification, and I'm sure there is, for the existence of these institutions, it is that they serve the public good. If they're not willing to tell what they do to serve the public good, then as far as I'm concerned, they ought to be closed down." And I say that partly because the welfare of these great constructive foundations and their opportunity for usefulness are constantly threatened by a confusion in the minds of people about what is a foundation. Now, that wasn't said by Justin Bieber. Okay? And it wasn't even said by Bill and Melinda Gates. It was said by my favorite foundation leader of all time, Russell Leffingwell. Now, who was Russell Leffingwell? Russell was a Republican banker, and in 1952, he was testifying before a McCarthy-era hearing in the United States on foundation support for un-American activities. Was the chair of the Carnegie Foundation Board, and he had the courage in those hearings to say those words. And he concluded his testimony by saying, "We think the foundation should have glass pockets." And actually, the organization I work for was created out of those hearings, and this was the founding quote that was used. So the talk today I've given you is really an invitation. It's an invitation to join what is a worldwide movement. The Foundation Center is part of it. Philanthropy Australia is part of it. University centers here are part of it. The China Foundation Center you heard about is part of it. To make information about philanthropy more transparent. And it's not a question just of accountability or somehow of oversight. What it's really about is realizing the potential that our industry, and we are an industry, a $1 trillion industry, has to do good in the world by taking advantage of the world of big data. Thank you.